Jasmine was just an invisible waitress, struggling to pay for her brother's studies. But that Tuesday, she saw what no one else saw, the glint of metal hidden beneath an assassin's suit. The target? Junho Park, the most feared man in the city. In a second, Jasmine had to choose, her life or his. What she didn't know was that that scream would change her destiny forever. She saw the glint before anyone else did, a flash of metal at the bar that didn't belong to a spoon or a watch, a little sunburst swallowed by the chandelier light. For a heartbeat, the restaurant remained a blur of forks and laughter, 1,000 small lights and the low hum of a city that felt itself invincible. Jasmine Carter moved through it the way she always did, careful, precise, invisible until something needed fixing. Tonight, the something was a table of regulars that had ordered their usual, a kid named Terrence's tuition in the ledger in her head, and the tight, steady knot of fatigue behind her eyes. She had been a waitress long enough to know where danger hid. It was never dramatic, not always. Sometimes it was a slumped shoulder, a voice that didn't fit the face. Tonight, it arrived in a tailored suit, a man who walked like he owned the air. Junho Park had the kind of presence that made people slide out of his way without meaning to. He sat down as if the chair had been waiting for him. He smiled at no one and at everyone. Men in dark coats shifted at his back like an annotation. Glasses were refilled with the silence of a courtroom. Jasmine kept her distance. The dining room was full, a Tuesday spill of wealthy patrons who liked understatement and good scotch. She had taken 3 shifts in a row to cover the final tuition installment. Her hands, always careful, felt rougher than usual. A memory threaded through her. Her mother in a hospital bed 2 winters ago, machine breath stolen, and bills that had no end. That memory was the kind that made a person quick, made them make choices before deliberation arrived. She passed a celebratory table and dropped a plate with practiced grace, the plate whispering against her palm instead of clattering. Destiny laughed. Marcus cracked some joke about late tips, and Jasmine smiled because it was work, because the rhythm kept the money coming and the worry at bay. Her attention was a line stretched tight between 2 points, this job and Terrence's future. It was so taut that when she saw the angle of the man's wrist, the glint, the lines snapped. At the bar, the man eased his hand into his coat as if it were a gesture of removing a chill. The metal caught the light under the low lamps, a menace small enough to be dismissed. Not everyone could see the geometry of danger. Those who could usually had to choose whether to speak. Jasmine's eyes narrowed without thinking. She moved toward the bar because the room was a network of moving parts and she knew the layout, where the tables would topple, which chairs could be upended into a path, the way a person's body could fall and block a bullet. She had barely taken 2 steps when time stretched, sound narrowed to a track, the clink of ice, a laugh cut short, the discreet click of a lock being released. Junho's profile was a statue in the middle distance. The barman's hand found the weapon's grip. Jasmine saw it, and there was no room for calculation. Her body responded with the kind of clarity people who lived in the margins developed, an instinct that prioritized protection over the self. "Look out!" she screamed. It was not an elegant cry. It cut across the room like a blade, ricocheting off lacquered wood and crystal. Heads spun. A glass flew. The bartender, reflexive, lunged. Junho jerked, the sound of a gun sliding out of its concealment replaced by a wet, sharp report that didn't echo so much as rip. Jasmine's arms were already forward, a barrier between the man and the man he meant to kill. Pain blossomed across her shoulder like a bright, hot coin. She tasted copper. Her body folded on command and still kept moving. She pushed the shooter's wrist with one hand, sank to the floor with the other, dragging the trajectory away from the man who had the world behind him. It was the single decisive moment she had not been trained for and had nonetheless made possible by a life spent keeping other people safe. 2 of Junho's beads were on the shooter before the second breath could be taken. A chair struck the bar. Someone screamed.
The sound of officers, or men who moved like officers, filled in the gaps. Jasmine's world telescoped into a single white star at the edge of her vision. She felt the warmth run down her side, and then nothing but static and the low, patient throb of a heart that refused to stop. When she inhaled again, the restaurant was a blur of blue and black and the metallic tang of fear. Her hands were slick. Terrence's face flickered across the inside of her eyelids, wide and bright, the boy who would never stop making her bargain with the world for his schooling. She tried to speak. Junho's face was over her, close enough that she could have reached out and smudged the city off the bridge of his nose. Up close, his eyes were dark, and not the kind of dark you saw on television. They were deep, tired, the kind that had given up on ease a long time before. "You saved me," Junho said, voice like a flat stone. It wasn't gratitude exactly, not the kind she knew how to take. It was recognition, a ledger entry written in a glance, an acknowledgement that had immediate cost attached. Someone was kneeling at her shoulder, a hand, warm, sure, on the wound. Jasmine tasted the breath of the world, antiseptic, the sweet of spilled wine, the iron of blood. Her shirt clung to her underarm. She tried to move, but the world had a new gravity.
But chatter around them had become radio static. Only the lost beat of her own heart mattered. She didn't hear sirens. She heard orders, low and controlled, the language of men who'd learned to let their urgency be practiced and precise. Junho didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He stared down at her as if attempting to read something inside that wouldn't give itself up. "You're under my protection," someone said, not with tenderness, but as a fact. It landed somewhere in the room like a verdict. The noise blurred into a ribbon of color. Jasmine's thoughts skated along it. Terrence, tuition, payments, the free clinic in her mother's old neighborhood that smelled like boiled cabbage and mercy. She had chosen to fall because protecting strangers was always the safer ledger to balance. Protecting someone in a suit filled with danger had never been a line on the list. She had been paid in small hours and smaller tips for years, and she had never expected a suit to owe her anything. "Will she be all right?" someone asked. "You'll be fine," the man at her shoulder said. He had a voice you could trust in an emergency, the voice of Diego Martinez, who always smelled faintly of cumin and olive oil. He pressed a napkin to her wound and kept his face level. His other hand moved in a way that said he had been trained, but also that he refused to be part of a machine. Jasmine liked him in the way you like a person who might keep you from bleeding out. "Can you stand?" Junho asked. He was not a man who conceded weakness easily. He wasn't asking to test her strength. He was cataloging the situation. She tried to laugh and a bubble escaped, thin and useless. Pain seared. Her shoulder was a column of heat. The restaurant's lights slurred. Her knees hit the floor and she felt, absurdly, a flash of embarrassment more than terror. She had wanted to be neither spectacle nor martyr. She had wanted to keep her brother safe, to keep her head down, and to graduate with as little drama as possible. This had not been on the syllabus. "You did what you had to," Junho said. His voice had a weight that settled across the chaos like dust. For the first time she saw him soften. A muscle quit its rigid line. He looked at her as if contemplating a shape he could not yet define. "You saved me." He did not say thank you. He did not have to. A hand took her phone from her pocket. Terrence's name stared up, tagged with an incoming message she never read. Someone said someone should call the hospital. Someone else said better to bring her to a private care facility. The language was all circles around the same conclusion. Jasmine Carter had just inserted herself into the orbit of a man who existed in public like a rumor and privately as an axis. That would mean protection. That would mean enemies. That would mean complication. She tried to protest, and the space between thought and sound became a wet, hungry something. The last thing she saw before the world fell away was Junho's profile against the restaurant's white light. Not a hero nor a monster, but a man whose life had the capacity to pull others into its wake. She thought of Terrence's laugh, of the rent notice folded in the nightstand, of the way her mother used to hum to herself when the television static filled the apartment. Then there was only a soft, insistent darkness. When she woke up, the ceiling above her had been reduced to rectangles of light and quiet. Her shoulder throbbed like a held secret. For a long moment, she had to remember the room.
It smelled sterile, but not too clean. It had the soft hush of private care. A late afternoon sun made the glass a wash of honey across the hardwood. That didn't fit with the restaurant. Her knees bucked when she tried to shift, and someone steadied her. "Easy," a voice said. Diego. His hand was there, warm and steady on her forearm. "You slept a long time." "How long?" she asked, and the world recalibrated. "A few days." He sounded like a man who'd been instructed to be both honest and circumspect. The penthouse was too quiet for a private clinic. The cushions were too expensive. The view, when she managed to sit up and look, was a beveled city of glass, the river like a strip of steel. Her Bronx neighborhood had been neither here nor there long before she was old enough to notice. Today, it pressed at the ribs of her memory. Brownstones, the corner bodega that sold cigarettes with a smile, the bus line that ran late, Terrence studying on the couch under the glare of a lamp. "You're not in a hospital," Diego said. "We thought you ought to be somewhere more private for a bit." "You thought?" Jasmine's voice came out coarse. She put a hand to her shoulder and it came away damp. She was alive, and someone had made the choice to remove her from the only home she had. "My brother." "He's safe," Diego said quickly. "He was brought to a friend's house. Naomi's handled that. He knows you're recovering." Naomi Park. Jasmine pictured a woman with a cautious smile she'd seen at the restaurant once when they had catered an event, and Junho had been seated at the same table. Naomi had that rare quality of speaking truth without making it an accusation. Jasmine had not met Junho's sister properly. Now she realized the family web had already started to move. "Why bring me here? I can go home. I can—" She stopped. The word "go home" held a million vulnerabilities when spoken in a space that was not home. Her chest tightened. The thought of Terrence alone in their small apartment, bills like mountains, brought the old knot of fear alive. She tried to think of leaving. The shoulder told her in plain language that walking even 10 blocks would be reckless. The city outside slid into the room through sound. Horns, a distant siren, someone laughing on a balcony, and she felt suddenly like a fish out of water. Junho had said she was under his protection.
The phrase lay there, patient as an invoice. "Why me?" she asked, looking for the greater reason between the facts. "Why put me in danger for him? Why not, I don't know, shut down the room and whisk him out?" Diego's expression shifted. He looked at Junho, who had not entered the room but was a presence at the edge of the door like a shadow. Junho stepped in like someone who had always known how rooms bent to him. He was not unkind when he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes all the way. He moved with the quiet of someone used to having space cleared without fuss. "You didn't let him die," Junho said simply. "That matters." He spoke with a kind of economical gravity that suggested he believed in small truths rather than grand statements. "You could have stepped back and saved yourself. You didn't. That is why you are here." "I'm not a charity case," Jasmine said. It came out sharper than she intended. She was not used to being the subject of someone else's plan. She was used to making plans and sticking to them. Junho's life smelled like old books and scotch, like something curated, like a room saved for a different time. It made her feel raw, like a hand without callus. "You were at a place where people will remember you. They will speak. There will be records. There will be those who think killing you will silence what you saw." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. "You can't keep me here," Jasmine said. "You saved my life, and now you expect me to be, what, grateful, indebted, babysat?" Junho's mouth tightened in a way that could have been sympathy or control. "I am offering you safety, for your sake and for your brother's." She laughed once, a sound that felt like a dry leaf. "Safety isn't something you give away, it's something you earn." The idea that someone who'd spent her life balancing other people's needs could be escorted into safety by a man who sat at tables with danger felt like a betrayal of her own values.
Her voice had always been lean and practical. She knew how to make ends meet without asking for the world to catch her. Diego's eyes flicked to Junho and then back to Jasmine. "We want to make sure the people who tried to hurt you are gone. We want to make sure Terrence is safe. That's the offer." "And what's the cost?" she asked. Cost always followed favors in the world she knew. Favors were never free. Junho was silent for a beat. When he spoke again, his voice had a softness to it Jasmine had not expected. "You have been captured. You are not a prisoner. You will have medical care. You will have your freedom when it is safe. For now, it is better that you stay." He looked at her with an intensity that made the room small. "I will be responsible for what happens to you. I will answer for it." It was not a threat, and it was not a plea. It was a declaration dressed as policy. Jasmine found herself thinking of the way keys could unlock doors and keep dangers out.
The problem was that the very locks he promised to keep in place were made from the same hands that could also close and never open again. "You speak like a man who plans everything," she said. There was accusation in it, and a strange relief. If he planned, then his choices were not simply whim. If he planned, then perhaps the machinery of his life could be pushed to do the right thing. Junho smiled without warmth. "I plan as necessary." There was a pause, thick as broth. Jasmine wanted to stand, to laugh, to call Terrence and tell him to come take her away. She tried to picture her life as it had been, the third-floor walk-up where the heater rattled, Terrence asleep on the couch with a textbook propped on his chest, her mother's photo on the mantel like a small sun. It did not fit the penthouse's hardwood shine. She had been placed in a world swaddled with quiet noises she had only heard on television. "Do you have any allergies?" Diego asked, paper ready, the human kindness of a trained caretaker. "I'm allergic to being told what to do," she said, but the pain under her skin made the barbs softer than she meant. She sat, fists tight in her lap. Junho listened more than he spoke. There were artifacts in the room that tried to explain him, a library wall with spines that suggested a curiosity for philosophy, not for the violent art people expected. A set of neatly folded blueprints under a lamp, his handwriting neat across the margin. Jasmine caught sight of one and saw outlines of simple buildings and a note about affordable housing. Something in her chest unclenched, puzzled and wary. "You want to be an architect?" she said, the phrase more like an accusation than a question. Her throat was dry. Junho looked at the page like it was an old map. He wanted to do things that lasted. "You do things that break others," she said. It wasn't noble. It was the blunt truth that had sat between them since the restaurant floor had become a field. She didn't know him beyond rumor and the brief polish of his presence, but she knew the world. The world she came from learned early the difference between preservation and predation. He did not deny it. "There is a difference between what I had to do and what I want to do now," he said. It was an answer that could be read in many directions. Diego cleared his throat. "You need rest," he said. "The wound's healing, but the shock—" "I don't want to be here because of some image," Jasmine said. "I don't want to be paraded. I'm not a symbol." "You're not a symbol," Junho said. His voice had no condescension. "You're a person." The irony of the line struck her. She had been erased into an event, and now someone was offering to restore her in exchange for her proximity. She did not know whether to feel grateful or wary. The tension inside her was not only physical, it was a moral reckoning. Later, after Diego had left and Naomi had come and left with Terrence tucked at her shoulder like a careful package, Jasmine lay on the couch and watched the city move. The penthouse window was a frame for the river and far-off bridges. A taxi horn stitched a rhythm into the twilight. She had taken someone's bullet, and it had made a road she had to walk whether she liked it or not. Safety had become a transaction. A message blinked on the nightstand. "Terrence, I'm okay. I'll be back soon. Love you." Jasmine's throat tight with relief. She reached for her phone, thumb hovering over the screen. Junho's offer smelled like obligation. It smelled like a ledger that only sometimes tilted toward mercy. In the small hours, when the city had thinned to the sound of distant tires and the hush of settled steel, Jasmine studied Junho from a safe distance. He did not sleep in the way she did, small, snatched, like it was a resource she had to steal. He sat at the small table and read by lamplight, a book open on his knee. The apartment around him ordered in a way that suggested no one could enter this room without it rearranging them. He moved through his space as if it were a place he had built and intended to keep. Sometimes he would walk to the window and stare at the city. She saw the loneliness there like a physical thing. It made his features fall into themselves, softened the hard line of his jaw. In those moments, she watched a man who carried an armor she didn't want to install in herself. She also saw the times his hand closed into the small, contained violence of command, how he could make a person follow with a single look. There was danger in a man who could be both tender and a storm. It explained how he had become what he was. It explained why he needed protection and why he offered it in equal measure. When she tried to sleep, her shoulder a constant reminder, scenes replayed with the strange fidelity of trauma, the glint, the cry, the press of the world against her ribs as blood warmed her shirt. She dreamt of Terence studying by the lamplight, of her mother tapping the rhythm of a hymn, of a city that might be kind if you let it. She woke, and the room was full of blue light and the soft footfalls of staff, one of whom always seemed to be there, patient as a watchful saint. The days after felt like a new alphabet. She had to relearn how to move without being an item to be managed. Every courtesy had a price. Every kindness was watched for intent. She began to notice small things, the way Diego left a kettle for her on the stove and didn't ask permission to put milk in the fridge. How Naomi would come by with groceries and a look that said she would not pry, but would be present if asked. How Junho read and folded his hands like he was pausing a sentence he didn't intend to finish. "You could go back," Naomi said one afternoon, when Jasmine had finally demanded the truth.
They were standing in the kitchen. Sunlight was a thin sheet across the counter. Naomi's voice was the careful kind, measured so the edges didn't ram into the furniture. "I could take you back to the block. It would be quick." Jasmine looked at the woman and saw a line she had heard in whispers that never reached her until now, the family who chose to be close in public but guarded in private. Naomi had a face that wore memory like an accessory. "And risk his enemies looking for me again?" Jasmine asked. "And if they figure out that I'm connected to him and—" "And Terence?" Naomi interrupted gently. "You know how that network works. You know they would not hesitate to use family." Jasmine's jaw tightened. Of course she knew. The world she came from taught you early how dominoes fell. She had come to the city with textbooks and a stubborn hope. Tonight, the city had answered with a bullet. "I don't like being told who I can see or where I can go," she said. It was both petty defiance and survival instinct. She hated the feeling of being watched. She hated the feeling of being kept. "Protection isn't permission, it's insurance. We keep you alive long enough for you to decide what to do. The choice, Jasmine, will be yours, but you need to be alive to make it." The logic was undeniable. The resentment hummed under it like static. Jasmine thought of Terence and his midnight ramen, of his stubborn grin, of how he would be crushed if she was gone. The ledger closed on her with a weight she had never wanted. "Do you trust him?" Naomi asked then. It was the real question. Jasmine thought of Junho's library and the bandage on her shoulder and the look he had given her when she cried once at the memory of her mother. She thought of the way he had not smiled when people expected it. She thought of the blueprints folded on his desk. "I don't know," she admitted. She had always learned to answer with practicalities rather than belief. "But I know this, there are worse alternatives." Naomi's face softened. She reached out and laid a hand over Jasmine's in a gesture that made the penthouse suddenly feel less alien. "Then rest," Naomi said. "Get your strength back. We'll figure the rest out." The days sprawled into a routine: physical therapy for the shoulder, conversations that were like small negotiations, the odd, awkward lesson in being a guest in a life that lived with its own rules. Jasmine resented it. She also admitted that she was grateful. She had been given clean sheets and someone else's responsibility for a change. It was an odd relief and an equally odd prison. Once, alone, Jasmine thumbed through one of Junho's books, a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius someone had dog-eared and annotated in the margins. The handwriting was neat. The ink had a kind of domestic intimacy to it. The idea that a man who could orchestrate so much violence could also care about how one ought to live. It unsettled her less than it should have.
Perhaps she had always wanted to be surprised. She began to ask questions in softer ways. Why did he keep certain men close? Why did he speak of shutting down a lane of his business once, decades ago, because of children? Why did he sit in the quiet like a man who loved something he had no right to keep? The answers were rarely whole. Junho would offer fragments: a memory of a father who taught him to plan, a decision to keep certain harms away, a line about the cost of choices. He did not beg for absolution. He did not name his sins like trophies. He outlined them like parts of a ledger. It made her uneasy and mildly curious. There were nights when she would wake and hear muffled voices in the hallway. Once she followed the sound and caught a glimpse of Junho arguing in low tones with Vincent. Vincent Chen's face was a razor of impatience, loyalty pinned to something more brittle. Jasmine retreated before she could be seen, but the image lodged: Vincent's expression, the tightness of his jaw. There were alliances even within protection. When she allowed herself to look at the mirror, she saw a woman who had been made of small compromises. Her shoulder was still tender. The scar would be a faded white line in time. Her life had shifted on a hinge. She hated it, and she was also grateful for the thin rope of care that now knitted her to others. She was still a waitress, still Terrence's older sister, still a woman who answered to debts in the ledger of survival. Days later, when a messenger asked her to sign a small form that suggested permanence for the immediate future, she paused. The ink felt heavier than it should. Diego hovered, patient as ever. "You can refuse," he said, as if aware she needed permission to be herself. She remembered the restaurant's noise like a hymn. She remembered the glint of metal and the way the bullet had burned bright. She thought of Terrence and the tuition he had to finish. She thought of her mother and the sound of a woman who had never had safety but had always found a way to make it for her children. She signed. For now. For the purpose of keeping a life from being taken wide open by those who sought to harm without reason. For the chance to be the woman who would one day stand on her own again. Outside, the city did not promise forgiveness or clarity. It offered only its streets and its starched possibilities. Jasmine sat back, the paper cooling under her hand, and felt the precariousness of it all. Saved by a shout, carried into a room of strangers who promised protection, tethered now to a man whose kindness and cruelty were braided together. The decision to stay, to be guarded, to be used as a name in someone's ledger, settled over her like a temporary outfit, uncomfortable, necessary, and perhaps a way to survive. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that something inside had shifted irrevocably. The city hummed. Junho's silhouette passed the window, unmoored and steady. For the first time since she had seen the glint, Jasmine understood that the line between protection and possession was thin, and that she had stepped across it without asking. If you're into gritty, emotional, true-to-life drama, hit subscribe. The first week blurred into a succession of small confrontations. Naomi's quiet insistence that she not return to the neighborhood unless it was safe, Diego's gentle firmness when she tried to make coffee and almost toppled the mug with her shaky hand. Junho's presence, which without overt command made the apartment feel both fortress and cage. There were questions she did not yet know how to ask. Who shot at Junho? Why had the shooter chosen the restaurant? How deep the reach of the men who wanted him gone? She began to discover the edges of the life to which she had been tethered. Junho's men handled the world with a vocabulary of security she did not speak. They talked about contingencies and leave-behinds. They moved in and out of the apartment in a rhythm that made it clear they were not guests, they were guardians, and their loyalty was an instrument that could be tuned. She watched them from a distance with the same curiosity she would lend to a storm, interested in the shape and the danger, careful not to step into the spray. On the 8th morning, after a restless night of dreaming about the restaurant, Jasmine leaned over the balcony and watched the fog lift from the river. The city seemed to rearrange itself beneath her. She thought of Terence studying at Howard, of his calls she tried not to miss, of their mother's photograph that sat in her nightstand like a promise she kept to herself. She had saved a man whose life had been a magnet to violence. She had been rewarded with safety and exile. A message arrived on her phone that made the hair on her arms lift. It was unsigned, and its contents were simple. "You did good. Don't trust Vincent." The words were markers on a map she'd only begun to draw. Someone knew enough to be kind and to warn. That alone made the penthouse feel smaller. She folded the phone onto her palm and felt, for the first time in days, like she was standing at the edge of something she had to choose how to cross. The city below did not care what decision she made. It simply continued, indifferent, inexorable. She had shouted, "Look out," and saved a man she did not know. Now she had to live with the aftermath. She turned back inside. Junho's office light was on. On the desk lay the folded architecture plans she had spied before. Jasmine crossed the room and picked up a page. A note in the margin read, "Affordable units for families, rooftop garden, community room to be run in partnership." She did not know if the plans were an attempt at atonement or a desire for a future he had never been allowed to have. She did know one thing: the presence of hope, no matter how small, unsettled the ledger again. Whatever Junho's past, there was a place inside him that still dreamed of building rather than breaking. The phone buzzed again. Another anonymous message. "He will be watching you. Be careful." Jasmine set the phone down and stared at the stack of blueprints as if they might fold into an answer. The apartment hummed with quiet power. The city breathed its indifferent breath beyond the glass. Somewhere in the world, a turn-coated servant would be weighing what they could gain by betrayal. She had been moved into a life of protection, and now she had to discern when protection tipped into property, when kindness was a currency and when it was a bond. She straightened the stack of papers, folded the page, and slid it back into the pile. Outside the window, the city shimmered. Inside, the wound in her shoulder throbbed, a small, constant argument. She wrapped an arm around herself and felt the fragile truth. She had said a thing in a loud room and saved a life. That single instant had collided with everything she owned. Now the aftermath was a new life she did not choose and a story she had to unfold, one careful choice at a time. The anonymous warning sat on her phone like a small, honest thing. "You did good. Don't trust Vincent." Jasmine stared at it until the words blurred. She laid the phone face down. The light reflected off the glass like a private sun. The penthouse hummed with distant traffic and the soft, practiced silence of people who had learned to move without announcing themselves. She imagined Vincent's face again, the taut jaw, the impatience that looked like loyalty, then folded the image and put it away. Warnings in that world were rarely casual. They were maps made out of ash. A week later, Naomi suggested a change of scenery. "Temporary," she said, and folded the word into her hands like a careful thing. The safe house in the Catskills would be quieter, Naomi said. Less trace, fewer cameras. It would be a place to rest, to let the shoulder heal and the stubbornness ease. Jasmine could have refused. She could have insisted on the old apartment, the old rhythms,
the small indignities of making rent from tips. Instead, she let the idea of fresh air and anonymity warm something that had been numbed by pain. Diego packed a bag with efficiency. He was a man who liked lists and the same brand of tea the way other people liked prayers. The ride north smelled of wet leather and coffee. The city slipped behind them until the horizon opened into trees and a thin sky. The safe house was a farm-style cottage with a wraparound porch and a toaster that popped at appliance-like intervals. For 3 days it was exactly that, an island of slow breakfasts and the tick of a clock she did not have to listen to every second. On the morning they were meant to return, Jasmine woke with a dry mouth and a colorless fear she could not place. She padded into the kitchen where Naomi had already started a pot. The light was brittle. There was a discreet knock at the door. 3, then a pause. It was a polite, measured code they'd been told meant friends. Naomi smiled the way the sister of a leader does when she believes in the thing that will come next. Jasmine shouldered her coat and opened the door. 2 men stood there, hands tucked into coats. One carried a duffel bag. The other's face was familiar in a way that made her chest compress. Parker, Mitchell. They had been on detail in the city, one of the rotating teams that would ensure the penthouse's walls were not just brushed by wind. Parker's smile was too wide. Mitchell looked like a catalog of small apologies. "What's up?" Jasmine asked. She had learned by then to gauge how much danger showed in a man's eyes. "Quick check," Parker said. "We're swapping teams. You coming back today, yeah? Junho wants you back to the city." Naomi's hand hovered in the doorway, a posture of small insistences. "It's routine," she said. "They thought it'd be better to move everyone today, just in case." Jasmine should have felt relief. Instead, she felt the old snap of alarm, the small, bright coins she'd tasted the night in the restaurant. She watched their hands. That was the way it began in rooms she knew, small movements that meant bigger decisions. She stepped back as if to let them pass, to show openness. The cottage door locked behind them. They moved with the clumsy choreography of people who had been taught to make things look ordinary. Jasmine caught Diego's eye and read his expression. There, an instant of calculation, then the steadiness that made other people breathe easier. They reached the car and the road. The ride started as it always did, a soft hum, the radio murmuring. Then a sound cracked through the quiet like someone tearing fabric, the sound that meant speed, then panic. Parker moved with a speed that felt like a betrayal. He leaned forward as if something in the seat had burned him. Mitchell's hand flashed out, and something fell between seat and console, and the world pivoted. Shots, a sudden orchard of noise, and the car swerved as if it had been given a new gravity. Jasmine's stomach felt shallow, her hands cold. The road slid sideways, and the trees blurred. They were not supposed to be in physical danger on that stretch of highway. They were supposed to be adults with jobs. But Parker and Mitchell were not what they had seemed. One reached for the rifle in the duffel bag, as if he had been waiting to do so. Diego's movement was the opposite of panic. It was a practical channeling of the moment. He threw himself across Jasmine, pushed her down, and the world tilted again. Glass exploded like a sound, and the car came to a stop with a practiced brutality. Breathing came ragged and hot. Naomi swore under her breath, and then, with the efficiency of a woman who did both charity and calculation, kicked the car door open. Parker's face was a leer now. Mitchell's hands were shaking. Approaching them, Jasmine felt an old current, how life sometimes presented you seasonal choices and demanded quick answers. She could run, she could scream, but running in a world of people with guns was often a choice to be followed by another gun. Instead, she moved forward. In the ditch, the men signaled one another. There was something almost ceremonial in their betrayal, an inside job, a trade in small deaths. Parker slashed a hand toward Naomi. The knife glanced off her coat. Mitchell turned for the duffel. Jasmine's body acted before she had the time to think. She lunged, a raw, necessary force. Her shoulder shot with phantom pain, but adrenaline braided through it and steadied the edge. Diego and Naomi moved as one, a practiced duet. Parker's aim was erratic. Mitchell scrambled, betrayed by nerves, jazz of bullets and the smell of burned rubber. Jasmine found herself pressed flat against the outside door, hand on a fallen piece of the bag, eyes level with Mitchell. He met her with a face that had become someone else entirely, greed replacing something like loyalty. The duffel gaped open and metal glinted. She saw distantly Vincent's profile in the passenger's window. He was the one who thrived in the margins, always just off stage, and that small sight felt like a verdict. Something inside Jasmine untied. For years she had been the person who kept the margins from dismantling the center of other people's lives. She had thrown herself in front of a bullet for a man whose life had terror in its gravity. Now she had to choose again. She reached for the only thing she could find, a compact car jack used for emergencies. It wasn't a weapon in any narrative she respected. It was a tool. She swung. The sound that followed was not pretty. Mitchell staggered, cursed, and there was a scramble. Naomi struck Parker with a fist that was a sermon. Diego grabbed Mitchell and pinned him with a strength that seemed soft because it was guaranteed. Parker's gun skittered across the floor. Jasmine's heart hammered. She felt simultaneously foolish and precise, like a woman who had learned to make use of whatever was at hand. When it was over, the ditch was quiet, except for breath and the rustle of leaves. Parker lay with a bloom of dark on his coat that would have to be tended by men with better tools. Mitchell cried softly, a sound that stripped bravado to its bones. Vincent had already melted into shadow. He was a ghost made of contracts and compromise. Naomi's hands were steady on a radio as she called for extraction and backup, her voice small but exact. "You all right?" Diego asked, kneeling by Jasmine, the concern in his eyes the kind that did not require explanation. She nodded. She was not all right. She was shaking in the way trauma likes to teach a body. But the instinct that had pushed her into the restaurant earlier, into bullets, into the space between Hazard and the person she was trying to keep, had widened.
It had become less of a reflex and more of a resolve. They returned to the penthouse with quiet speed. Junho was there at the door, as if he'd been waiting for a weather bulletin, his face long, fingers interlaced. He looked at Jasmine not with judgment, but with an assessment that measured risk in a currency that didn't quite match money. He moved to her as if testing a current. "You could have stayed quiet," he said, the phrase a ledger of what could have been. "You didn't." "Staying quiet gets people killed," she replied, and there was no sermon in it, only the blunt arithmetic of her neighborhood. Naomi explained what had happened in clipped sentences. Parker's betrayal had been arranged. Mitchell had accepted money. Vincent's absence was not a mystery. Junho's jaw tightened, and for a moment something like fury returned to him. But then his face closed again into the thing Jasmine had started to understand, the practiced containment of a man who had learned to close wounds with decisions. "We clean it up. We find Vincent." "You say that like it's a job order," Jasmine said. "It is," he admitted. In the days that followed, paranoia folded itself into routine. The FBI, which had been hovering as a backdrop since the restaurant shooting, stepped closer. Agents with neat ties and slower voices called in formalities. Junho answered with the polite economy of a man who knew how to speak to those who could end his current life. He did not plead ignorance. He did not throw men under the bus unless the bus could be directed toward someone the law would take. The conversation with the agents was not an argument about morality. It was a negotiation about consequence. The anonymous messages continued, small breadcrumbs. "Meet me at Grand Central if you want the truth." They were unsigned, a riddle in a public cathedral. Jasmine hated the thought of being paraded through the city again, but the idea of intelligence, of someone willing to risk speaking, pulled like gravity. Naomi insisted that it was better for Jasmine to go alone, less trace, and offered to shepherd Terrence to a safe spot. Junho argued a different calculus. Finally, they compromised.
Jasmine would go with 2 discreet guards. Naomi would be nearby, but not visible. The station was a cathedral of motion. People moved through prayer-like gestures, some hurried, some lost. Jasmine kept her hands in her pockets and told herself to be ordinary. She had been anything but ordinary for months. The message said, "Look for the man with the red cap." Jasmine found him near a newsstand, the cap a dented relic. He looked like an extra in a movie about regret, shoulders a little too slouched. "I'm Junho's," he said when she asked, and there was no bravado in it. Not a friend, but not an enemy either. He handed her an envelope sealed with tape older than tape should be.
Inside was a single photograph. Vincent shaking hands with a man Jasmine recognized from the old headlines, Volov, by a loading dock. A name on the back, Bogdan. The proof sat in Jasmine's hands like a small, terrible thing. "Why give this to me?" she asked. "Because you don't move like everyone else," he said. "You don't pretend you are free of consequences. Vincent likes to assume people will take bribes. He doesn't count on those who will act." That night, Junho came home with a bandage on his forearm that told of a recent scuffle. Naomi closed the door and breathed out a word that might have been a prayer. Junho's face was set in a way that made the room colder. He did not speak of the Grand Central photograph as if it were a trophy. He handled it like a patient who had discovered a storm map. "She gave it to me," Jasmine said. She had kept the envelope, although she could have handed it to Naomi as an offering for the family's protection. Instead, she felt the dangerous pride of holding a secret that put pieces together. Junho set his cup down and looked at her. For the first time since the restaurant, she saw something like gratitude, not the transactional kind, but a small human sorrow. "You keep stepping into danger for others," he observed. There was no reproach. It was an observation that had weight. "Because someone has to. Because no one else is always there for Terence." He closed his eyes for a breath. "I won't let them take you." She thought of the line between protection and possession and the way Junho's words kept sliding along it. "You already took me once," she said. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the window and stared at the city as if seeing it for the first time. "Then I'll make sure I am punished for it in a way that keeps you alive," he said eventually. "Legally, sanely, as best as a life like mine allows." The plan that formed was less a scheme and more an act of necessity. If Vincent had deals with Volov, if Volov had the reach of a rival that could upset Junho's world, then they needed to draw the betrayer into a place where his options would be limited. The FBI would want Vanesson's moves documented. Junho wanted leverage. Jasmine wanted the knowledge that the man who had used her and then threatened her brother would answer for it. It was Jasmine who volunteered to be bait. "No," Naomi said immediately, a small sharpness in her voice that came from sisterhood. "You are not a lure." "I am tired of being used," Jasmine said. "If I'm going to be used, I want to be the one who uses the tool." Diego's face was a map of concern and trust. Junho studied her like a man measuring a precious object. She read in his expression the same calculus she had seen in the restaurant. Danger catalogued, reflection like a ledger. He had learned to be ruthless. He had also learned that ruthlessness came at a price. "You know what this means," he finally said. "It could go sideways."
"It could," she agreed. "But it could also mean Vincent can't hurt us anymore." They moved like a team rewiring a fragile instrument. Naomi made calls, smoothing conversations into patience. Diego trained Jasmine in the obvious things, how to make an exit look accidental, how to read a face for intent, how to keep her phone from sounding like it was tapping. Junho tightened security and, most unusually, put himself in a position of risk that he had not allowed before. He would not hide in the shadows. He would be part of the trap. It was the first time he had voluntarily put himself under a light he could not extinguish. They chose Red Hook for the confrontation, a warehouse district of rust. shipping crates, and the kind of open air that let sound move for good or ill. It was the kind of place that made you small and exposed, but also gave corners where plans could be hidden. Jasmine practiced what she would do. She wrote small notes to Terence, little armor against fear. She folded them into her coat. She made herself breathe through the old rituals, her mother's songs in her head, Terence's grin in a mental photograph. On the day of the bait, the sky was iron. The city had that quality of being braced for winter and yet unwilling to announce its surrender. Jasmine walked into the warehouse with a measured step, the echo of her shoes a slow drum. The building smelled of oil and cold metal. Her breath made small ghosts in the air. She wore a coat too light for the weather, which made her look like someone who would be an easy target, like a stray in need of help. Vincent showed up late, of course. He was a man who liked to keep his adversaries waiting and his patience trimmed. He arrived with a retinue that smelled of expensive cologne and the sort of polite violence that made others nervous. Jasmine watched him from the half-light, the sun sliding through broken panes and painting him in stripes. "You look tired," he said as he approached, the words like a blade wrapped in velvet. "Maybe I am," Jasmine replied, her voice steady like a line drawn in chalk. "Maybe I was never the quiet type." Vincent smiled as if he were pleased by her defiance. He stepped closer than necessary, the space between them thick with old debts. "Do you think you saved Junho twice?" he asked. "That's funny." "Did you want something?" Jasmine asked. "Everything," Vincent said, and there was that old animal hunger in his eyes. "Power, control, a little chaos for people like you. Test their loyalty, see who stands, see who cracks." It was as if categories of his betrayal lit up. He didn't deny it. He described in half motifs the way systems of exchange worked, as if he were teaching a class. Jasmine thought of Parker and Mitchell, of the duffel in the ditch, of the messy arithmetic of men who believed that money answered everything. She had come to this warehouse with the muscle of someone who had been pushed and had chosen to push back. The first gunshot felt like a punctuation mark someone had stamped into the air. It was not the cinematic barrage, but the clinical sound of choices being enacted. Men had positions. Naomi was a shadow outside the main doors, a watcher who knew how to move in silence. Diego took cover behind a metal crate, his face open in a way that made Jasmine want to run to him and laugh at how the world had turned her life inside out. Vincent tried to be theatrical. He grabbed Jasmine, twisting her arm in an attempt to use her as leverage, as bait with teeth. For a moment she felt the old helplessness slip back in, a tide securing itself around her ribs. Then she remembered the ditch, the car, the way a tool had become an instrument. She remembered Parker on the ground, the way the world had rearranged when she hit back. She moved. Her elbow found a seam in Vincent's grip. She smashed her shoulder into him, not to maim, but to surprise, to make the choreography fail. He cursed. Diego lunged. Junho emerged from shadow as if materialized, his face unadorned by violence, but steeled for decision. The men who had been Vincent's retinue reacted with the clumsy certainty of those who had expected the script to play like it always had. The warehouse turned chaotic and intimate at the same time. Bullets punched the air but didn't write instruction manuals. There was no neat choreography to copy. Crates toppled, the smell of powder and cordite braided into the cold. Jasmine's heart was a drumbeat in her throat. She moved with a fierceness she had been learning to trust, less instinct now and more intent. She ducked and rolled, used cover, grabbed Vincent at a bad angle and twisted. For a terrifying second, Vincent had her as a living shield. His voice shot through the air with the kind of menace that lives only in men who know the weight of a gun. "Don't," Junho said. It was not a plea, it was a line drawn where someone would fall if crossed. He had arms that were not the warm kind, and hands that were seasoned in giving orders. But he also had a voice that could stop things because it counted as fact. Diego flanked Vincent, and for the first time Jasmine saw that power could be shared. It did not belong to one person alone. She felt the barrel of a gun close to her temple, and the world narrowed to a single clean edge. For a long, thin breath, Vincent kept her there, an instrument twisted into demand. His eyes were full of a calculation she had seen in other rooms, a man counting the value of people as if they were coins. He wanted leverage. He wanted the thing that could make Junho kneel. Junho didn't kneel. He moved. It was not theatrical. It was the slow, grave measure of a man who had decided to pay a price himself. He stepped forward and did what he had always done. He used his presence as an argument. He had his men on the other side, invisible forces that made the air different.
For a second, Vincent seemed to be wrestled by choice, by the weight of options he couldn't see. There was a flash of motion, Diego's elbow, Naomi's long reach, and then sound folded into itself. The FBI arrived, not like a Deus Ex machine, but like a careful tide. They had been tipped off in the convoluted way these things sometimes happened. Agents moved in, authoritative and clinical. Vincent cursed and tried to bargain, but bargains have to land in tongues that are willing to listen. The men around him faltered. It was not clean. There were broken boards and the burn of fear. But Vincent, unnerved and now exposed to the scrutiny of the law, found himself in a net he hadn't anticipated. At some point later being a flood of images in a narrow corridor of minutes, Vincent was cuffed and led away. He shouted that Junho would pay and that Red Hook would have others. He traded threats like men throw dice, but his voice thinned as the agents walked him past, the chain of consequence snapping into place. Junho didn't smile when it was done. The victory felt less like triumph than the cessation of noise. He crossed the distance to Jasmine and put a hand on her shoulder, the gesture of a man trying to anchor himself with something small and true. "You were reckless," he said. "You asked me to be bait," she replied. "I asked you to be brave," he corrected softly. She let the words settle. It had a weight she had not expected. She had been brave, and the experience left a bruise and a new seam in her consciousness. She had acted. The line she had crossed in the restaurant, where instinct had pushed her into the path of a bullet, had become a path she walked with intention. The FBI took statements. There were photographs and forms, and the bureaucratic tenderness of official ears. Junho answered with a measured cooperation that surprised even those who had watched him for years. He did not throw men away like trash, but he also did not protect those whose names had been bought and sold. Vincent's arrest would make for a paper trail that could be used in larger cases. Volov's network would feel the tremor. For a person like Junho, the decision to hand a man to the authorities was both practical and corrosive. He had to trade in the currency of his life to buy the possibility of a better one. In the weeks after, Junho made a choice that staggered Jasmine in its simplicity and gravity. He met with prosecutors and with men in suits that smelled faintly of civility. He agreed to cooperate in ways that would reduce his leverage but increase his safety. He would provide information, hand over accounts of things the authorities cared about, and in return he would ask for mercy in a limited, pragmatic measure, a plea that would take him from a life of constant violence to a fixed number of years in prison, a term dignified, reduced, a sentence weighted for redemption and accountability. "You're not giving up everything," the prosecutor said once, leaning forward. "You're trading violent options for legal ones. It's workable." Junho listened like a man calculating interest. He had always been someone who knew how to convert risk into plans. He said, "I want it to be enough to change the trajectory." The plea was not grouped in glib absolution. It was a papered compromise. Junho agreed to a negotiated sentence, 3 years with possibilities of reduction for cooperation and good behavior, and to testify where necessary. It was a bargain that would cost him freedom, and in a more private way, his identity. For Jasmine, the news landed with the complicated relief of someone who had finished a fight but realized the war had left scars. "You're sure?" she asked. He looked at her as if the material of his life had been realigned. "No one can be certain," he said, "but I can make choices that allow me to build towards something else. I can try to keep my hands clean when I have to. I can try." She leaned into him for a second, the gesture private and small, the kind that does not make it into photographs. For a man who had been an axis of danger, there was a rare admission of want, a desire to put bones under plans that lasted. He spent the remaining months before surrender in understated acts of making, meeting with architects who could help him finish his drawings, sending discreet checks to a housing project proposal, sitting with Naomi as she smoothed complicated ties. Jasmine found herself living between two clocks, the slow tick of Junho preparing to surrender and the patient tick of her own education. She returned to classes when she could. Nights found her studying under the lamp, the same way that Terence had done, a different generation mirroring the old. She balanced hospital shifts with study, with visits to a clinic that smelled like boiled greens and hope. The irony of a woman who had put herself between danger and a man who would go to prison, now practicing to heal others, did not escape her. Trials are not the tidy stories of movies. They are rooms of paper and the slow measurement of truth. Vincent's arrest led to hearings that exposed old networks. Evidence gathered by the FBI pulled other threads. Junho's cooperation brought more than the closure of a single arrest. It pressed into the seams of a system that had enabled cycles. Yet for all its theater, the legal process is a grinding wheel. Junho accepted its friction. He agreed to surrender himself, to be processed, to face the indignity of a prison uniform and the absence of the little luxuries that had once gilded his life. The night before he turned himself in, Junho invited Jasmine to a small dinner at a back room of a restaurant that felt quieter than the world deserved. They ate without ceremony. Junho had a restraint to his appetite that was more hunger for silence than for food. He handed her a set of small keys, the key to a bank box where he had stored plans, contracts, and money that had been earmarked for the beginning of an affordable housing project he claimed he wanted to complete lawfully. "If this is all part of keeping you safe," Jasmine said, twisting her fingers around the keys, "then I accept it." "It is part of it," Junho said, "and it is part of me trying to be the man I once wanted to be." They did not kiss under the table or promise tomorrows. They made smaller vows, that she would continue her schooling, that he would do his time without flinching, that he would not ask her to wait without the tools to do so. He left in the morning with the suit of a man who had made a decision that would cost him the comfort of present power for the possibility of future life. Jasmine watched him go and felt the distance of a horizon that had simultaneously closed and opened. Prison visits were a new geography. The first was the hardest, lining up behind glass, the world reduced to gestures and words traded through glass, and a phone that made everything sound like a broadcast. Junho's hair was shorter, his hands had lines that had not been there, his eyes still held the outline of a man who had given something up. They spoke cautiously at first, like people avoiding the cracks. "How is the shoulder?" he would ask. It was a small domestic question, and it made Jasmine want to laugh and cry in equal measures. "Better," she would say, and mean it, because healing is often a ledger of small steps. She finished nursing school with a stubbornness that made the teachers smile. She worked nights in the emergency room and day shifts in community clinics. Terence graduated and found work that was honest and steady. The family from the third-floor walk-up thrummed with a different kind of music, less worry in their steps, though the bills still came. Jasmine had no illusions that the life they had would become easy. She just had enough pieces to make hope plausible. During the months Junho served, they built their intimacy on letters, visits, and small acts of care. Junho wrote about architecture in ink that sometimes smeared because the papers were thin. He sent her a drawing of a rooftop garden with benches and a line about children and sunlight. Naomi sent occasional updates with folded humor. Diego checked in and was always eager-eyed about the changes he saw in both of them. Months lengthened into years.
Junho served the sentence solemnly. He did his work inside, reading, walking, taking classes where possible, and refusing the perverse comforts of old loyalties. He wrote a paper about adaptive reuse and community spaces that earned attention in small academic circles. When the day of his release came, it was not cinematic. He walked out of a gate and straight into a morning that hummed with the normalcy of buses and people who still had to get to work.
Jasmine was waiting on the sidewalk with coffee in a disposable cup and a scarf she had knitted with clumsy fingers. You could call it a reunion, and it would be accurate in the simple sense that two people walked into one another's orbits again. But there was an ordinariness to it that made it quieter and truer than a movie scene. Laughter, a hug that lasted, a shared exhale. Junho had the faint lines of someone who'd been taught to take the small mercies and not expect absolution. They married in a simple ceremony in the community center of a housing project that Junho had helped fund in a previous life and now pledged to continue in lawfulness. The crowd was a collage of faces, some from Jasmine's neighborhood, some from Junho's employees who had chosen to walk a different road. Naomi with a smile that betrayed her private pride, Diego with a grin and eyes that were honest in their joy. Terrence, now a man with his own stories, sat near the front. There was no gilded promise, no declaration that everything had been washed clean. There were simply vows that made sense for long work, to build, to repair, to try. They spoke the kinds of promises that were less about fate than daily action. Years later, the housing project took the roof garden Jasmine had once seen in Junho's sketches and made it into a rooftop community room the neighborhood could use. They opened a clinic in the ground floor that offered low-cost care to those who needed it. Jasmine worked there, her hands steady with the experience of someone who had held life and death in the same breath. Junho taught a night class on adaptive architecture and sat on a board that allocated funds for after-school programs. They argued sometimes in the quiet hours about the pace of projects, about how much to reveal of the past to the children who asked, about the way power could sneak back in if left unattended. They had fights that were honest and sharp and then patched. There were moments of tenderness that looked like dishes washed together at midnight, a kettle simmering, laughter braided into ordinary chores. The city they lived in was the same one that had shot and singed their edges, and also the same one that sometimes stitched them back together. Jasmine would sometimes find herself on a night shift reflecting on the strange geometry of the life she'd been given. How an instinctive shout in a crowded room had reoriented everything. She was not proud in a performative way. She understood the gravity of what she had done and the costs it extracted. She had saved a life once by accident and later by design. She had been forced into a life of intimacy with a man who had been a force of destruction and then chose to repair. There were parts of that story that still stung, and parts that warmed like a sunlit corner. The last time she saw Vincent's face in public, it was in a news clip. He was led into a courthouse for an appeal that seemed to have flared and sputtered. His mouth moved, but no sound reached the rest of the world as it used to. He had not become someone the city wanted to remember kindly. He had become a cautionary tale, the measure of what greed could harvest. That was justice in narrow forms. Years later, walking the rooftop garden, Jasmine watched a gaggle of children pull weeds and plant bulbs. Junho was on a small ladder fixing a loose light. He looked up at her and grinned, a small, private thing that meant they had survived more than each had promised. She leaned against the railing and thought of the restaurant, of the glint of metal, of the sound of her voice that night. That single second had unfolded into a life neither of them could have predicted.
"Do you ever regret it?" Junho asked, wiping his hands on his jeans and planting the ladder again. "Regret what?" she said. "Everything that followed after you shouted. The way your life changed. Mine." There was no accusation in his voice, only curiosity. She thought for a long time. The children ran beneath them, laughter like a small bell. Terence waved from below, his own family now a small constellation. Naomi was handing out cups of lemonade as if she were a saint of accrued patience. Diego's hair had flecks of gray, but his smile hadn't dimmed. The city moved as always, loud, indifferent, hopeful in the way only cities can be. "I don't regret saving someone from getting killed," Jasmine said finally. "I don't regret protecting my brother, and I think I would do it again. But I regret that the world made it so that I had to choose between safety and being myself. I regret that choices had to cost so much." Junho nodded slowly, accepting this ledger of small truths. "Then we keep building," he said. "We keep fixing what we can. We teach the kids to shout a different kind of warning, one that calls people towards safety, not because of fear, but because of love." She smiled then, and it was not small. The city rolled out beneath them, indifferent and yet the kind of place that cradled possibility. Jasmine had shouted, "Look out," in a room full of crystal and scotch. That shout had been a filament that had burned into a life. It had taken them through betrayal, legal consequence, careful acts of repentance, and a decision to exchange a life of violence for one of public service. It had taught her that saving someone's life did not mean surrendering her own. It taught her how to shape a life with intention. In the garden, children planted bulbs, and someone sang a tune that reminded Jasmine of the hospital where her mother had once hummed. She held Junho's hand. They were not perfect, nor were their lives free of consequence, but they were a pair who had rebuilt one small brick at a time, a community sewn thinly back together by ordinary, steady work. The ledger had not been erased, but for the first time it balanced in ways that made the idea of hope less fragile.
If this story spoke to you about sacrifice, about second chances, tell someone who needs to hear it. Like and subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from.